You found it. Your home for the best content on your favorite team, the Fighting Tigers of LSU. Do us a favor, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments below, and be sure to smash that like button. Wilson Alexander had a sit down with Brian Kelly last week, and the quote that came of it, of course, was about Harold Perkins moving inside linebacker. On the eve of LSU returning to the field for the start of spring practice, we welcome Wilson Alexander to the show. How are you, man?
Doing well, Matt. How are you today?
Doing really well. The quote that you ran from Brian Kelly, sometimes people react in a certain way to a piece of a long-form conversation that you have to boil down. Is there any more context or anything with the conversation when you were sitting there talking to Brian Kelly about Harold Perkins that stood out?
Well, I mean, the thing that stood out, I think, was probably what people can remember the most, that he'll be going back to inside linebacker. I mean, most specifically, maybe some of the things that get lost in translation with this, or that he's going to be the will linebacker, the weak side linebacker. For those who kind of know football knowledge, terminology, that's kind of specifically where he'll be playing. But very for more of a boiled down version, he's going to be in the box, and they want him to be active around the line of scrimmage and not pulled away from the action. And I think maybe what might better answer your question is kind of how they got here. LSU's defense now is going to have what's called a star position. You see these across college football. Georgia has one. Alabama has one. The Nick Saban defense has always had them. And it's something that's very prevalent. But LSU hasn't used that position, at least in a few years. I'm not sure if it ever necessarily has. And it's kind of a nickel, and it's kind of a cross between, what Harold did last year as the Sam nickel linebacker. But it's usually played by defensive backs. And Brian, said last week that's not where they want Harold to be. And so, without that position and that kind of spot in the defense changing a little bit, inside linebacker is, kind of a natural, I guess maybe slide over, maybe better suited for him. But obviously we see that didn't go well last year. And so it's going to have to be a lot better with new coaching. And that's something else, is that, under an aggressive style of defense that you would think LSU is now going to have with Blake Baker, perhaps that will help it work out better. At least that's the hope.
Every time they go out for spring or fall camp, there's always storylines. And you brought up the coaching. When you replace the staff on an entire staff on one side of the ball, that clearly is going to be one of the foremost storylines. What are you expecting to see, thinking to see, looking for at practice throughout spring and on day one, Tuesday?
Well, in terms of what we're going to see differences in terms of coaching, first right off the bat is, are they doing anything differently in terms of tackling and coaching tackling and some of the fundamentals that this team struggled with last year, and run fits and pursuing the football. There's certainly things that they practiced over the last few years, but are they going to do anything differently in that regard to try to improve some of those basic things that this team struggled with defensively? Is probably something that we'll be able to glean a little bit of during spring ball. But also just, in terms of schematics, what is this Blake Baker defense going to look like? It's, known for being multiple at Missouri, and they've mixed up their coverages a good bit. And, you could watch a game to game at Missouri, and they did, 4-2-5 and a 3-3-5, and they mixed things up. But what is he going to do here at LSU? Maybe we'll start to figure that out a little bit, even though we all know how vanilla spring can be. But on another level, just, what are these coaches getting out of these players? Are they putting them in the best position to succeed? Those are questions we'll keep asking. I don't know if we'll necessarily find out in the spring, but that's certainly something that I'll be kind of trying to find out, looking for. And also on top of that, just who's winning these position battles at corner.
I was going to ask you about defensive line. Since you brought up corner, let's just go there. What's your thought on what we're going to see at corner this spring?
Well, it's a completely wide open competition. I think we're going to see guys rotating in and out of there. And, one day we might be out there and we see somebody at first team corner, and the next day we might see somebody else, because there's so many guys at that position, but none of them being proven. We'll get a better look at J.K. Johnson coming off the injury, Jair Brown transferring from Ohio State, Ashton Stamps, and does Sage Ryan stick at corner? Does he move over to maybe nickel or play the star or something like that? Same thing with Javian Toviano. Where is he at? I think that we're going to see a lot of rotation, and that it's going to be just the signs of a wide open competition that really probably won't get figured out unless somebody just explodes onto the scene here during the spring. And even then, won't get figured out until preseason camp.
I didn't prep you for this, but off the top, do you know if anybody's not available? I would assume Zy Alexander would not be available, but anybody else not available in that secondary for spring?
Zy's the only one.
Okay.
But in the slight positive silver lining to all that is that Brian Kelly said that he's expected to be back for summer workouts, and that with that, unless there's any setbacks, he'll be able to participate. At least they expect him to come preseason camp. So that's obviously a good thing with a guy who started 8 games last year, being able to go back into that kind of a competition. Then he's the only one across the entire team, not just the secondary, who, when I asked Brian Kelly who will miss spring practice, he was the only person who Kelly named.
He's on Twitter at WHAlexander_ or Whalesander _ You can do it that way, either way. Hey, so let me ask you about the defensive line, because that has got to be the position group that is the most obviously glaring weakness just from a bodies standpoint. Why when you talked about that with Brian Kelly, why might he have reason for optimism there? What are they going to do there with that defensive line, the interior defensive line spot?
Well, it's still a position of concern. And talking to Brian Kelly, he's not doom and gloom about it, but is acknowledging that, that's something that they're going to have to shore up and kind of figure out. I think that they're going to go after that position again come the spring transfer portal window. But in the meantime, they're going to move Kimo Makaniole over there from the offensive line to at least provide some depth. And that was kind of where Kelly was maybe expressing optimism, is he thinks that they've got now enough depth to get through the spring. In the season, that's maybe a different kind of conversation, maybe a different tone. But at least for the next, month, these 15 practices, they've got now technically 5 sort of scholarship defensive tackles plus some walk-ons there. So it's enough to maybe, kind of run through things normally and not have to fully adjust just because you're so thin at defensive tackle. And so maybe that was some optimism. But he certainly acknowledged that, that's still a position of concern and a place where they're going to have to figure things out and maybe make some additions because of the numbers problem there at defensive tackle.
Yeah, Kimo Makaniole, who spent his whole career as an offensive line, is going to flip over to defensive line just so they have some numbers. But reinforcements are going to be on the way come fall ball, but still a ways till we get there. A couple more for you. It's amazing, Wilson. You and I have been talking almost 10 minutes now. I haven't even brought up Garrett Nussmeier. So, it's kind of the nature of what they're facing right on the defensive side. So let me ask you about Garrett and your conversation with Brian Kelly, what he had to say about his starter.
The word that Brian kept using was consistency, and that they want to draw that more out of Garrett Nussmeier. We've all seen Garrett Nussmeier's arm talent and what he's capable of throwing, on a football field and what he can do with his arm. But he's a less than 60% career passer who's thrown 7 interceptions in 219 career attempts. They want him to be a little bit more consistent in his progressions, not abort early, which is something that Brian Kelly said he sometimes had a tendency to do. And they want to see him just be consistency at practice in terms of how he's kind of leading the offense and how he's holding himself and his attention to detail. That's something that Jayden Daniels did a good job of over the last 2 years, and now as the starter, and that's Garrett's turn to show that he can do that. Talking to Garrett over the last month, going to the bowl game, he always tried to hold himself to that, but it's just different being the starter. So they want him to be consistent in practice in terms of how he's approaching it every day, and then consistent in terms of what he's doing technically in order to become a passer who, as Kelly said, if he can be consistent, can be really, really good.
Are they going to try to add any more running backs, Wilson?
He didn't say. It wasn't quite something we got into. I don't know yet. I think we'll find out kind of over the course of the spring. They're in a tough situation here, obviously, with Trey Holly indefinitely suspended and Kadam Durr not getting here until the summer. That's one thing that did come up, was just how careful they're going to have to be with Josh Williams and Caleb Jackson here throughout the spring, because they have a lot of reps to go around. They're changing the running game completely without Jayden Daniels, who's going to be a lot more put on these running backs. But he already said they want to be careful with Josh Williams just because of some wear and tear and maybe tendonitis in his knee. They don't want to, waste him now and, not have him available in the fall. And then Caleb, you just don't want to overload him. So they're going to have to really be careful with that position group. Yeah. And then I think maybe we'll find out throughout the course of the spring how interested they are in adding someone else. Some of that might hinge on what happens with Trey Holly. He's
Wilson Alexander, LSU beat writer from The Advocate, on Twitter at WHAlexander_. Wilson, if I asked you, what is the thing you are most interested in seeing this spring? You personally, what would be at the top of your list?
I guess a couple things would be maybe how things shake out at wide receiver. Just seeing those new guys, C.J. Daniels and Xavion Thomas, is certainly up there. LSU's got to replace a ton of production at receiver, so are those two guys capable of sliding right in being instant impact players and getting more out of Kyron Lacey and some of these younger guys. I think that's going to be interesting. The competition at corner will certainly be up there. And then probably just, how things, obviously now with Harold playing inside, that'll be something as well. And then probably just what do we see out of these new coaches? What can we start to glean from them? Because that's going to be crucial, especially on the defensive side. So I think those would probably maybe be my top 4 or 5 kind of things.
It all gets started on Tuesday out on the Ponderosa. Make sure you're following him on Twitter. Read stuff over at The Advocate. He's Wilson Alexander. Thanks, man. Appreciate it as always.
Thanks, Matt. Have a great rest of your day.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact. And be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.